This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. You're watching a course called Faith, Knowledge, and Reason, which deals with the philosophical presuppositions of the theological tradition. Today we're working with Descartes, and we've been working through the meditations here, and we've now come to this very famous argument that we have an idea of perfection. It's a clear and distinct idea of perfection, that the cause of a thing must have at least as much reality as the effect, that is, of that thing, that, of course, nothing else can then cause the idea of perfection other than a perfect being itself. So from the reality of the idea of perfection, Descartes argues to the reality of that being which implants the idea of perfection in us. This is God. This is an infinite being, right? And this infinite being must be perfect because, of course, the idea of perfection is perfect, right? Perfect, by the way, comes from the Latin perfecere, which means complete, right? He argues that a perfect being cannot be a deceiver by definition, just as a triangle cannot have more than two right angles, that the angles of a triangle cannot total sum to more than two right angles. So a perfect being cannot be a deceiver. It's part of the essence of perfection, if you will, to be non-deceptive. It's a conceptual truth. If you're a perfect being, you're not a deceiving being. Thus, as he argues, since I have an idea of an infinite being, perfection, there must be a perfect being that exists outside of me who is not systematically deceiving me in all of my putative claims to knowledge. But now a contemporary of Descartes seems to spot a problem. Arnaud writes, I have one further worry, namely how the author, that is Descartes, avoids reasoning in a circle when he says that we are sure that what we clearly and distinctly perceive is true only because God exists. But we can be sure that God exists only because we clearly and distinctly perceive this. Did you catch all of this? Hence, before we can be sure that God exists, we ought to be able to be sure that whatever we purely or perceive clearly and distinctly and evidently is true. Now, if you follow the presentation so far, you can see that I was perhaps engaged in a bit of circularity, and maybe Descartes is too. This is actually called the Cartesian circle, and there's a lot of scholarship on the Cartesian circle in Cartesian studies. Scholars are divided as to whether Descartes successfully answers the charge. Cartesian circle, again, I have this clear and distinct apprehension of an infinite being, and then I clearly and distinctly reason to this perfect being that exists outside of idea. And why did I need to do this? Well, I needed to do this in order to make it the case that my clear and distinct apprehensions of putative truths cannot be incorrect, right? So I'm presupposing, it seems like, the very thing that I'm trying to prove. I'm begging the question. Well, one can make an argument here that Descartes does not do this. One could argue that he does do this. I'm not going to get into those technical arguments today, but at least to point out to you that this is certainly a problem that needs to be addressed. So, I mean, again, the problem from the conclusion that God is perfect and has created human beings, Descartes now argues that human beings have knowledge. Okay, now let's put that aside and go to the next bit here. When I talked about Scotus, I tried to connect Scotus to Descartes. And Descartes, of course, is connectable to Scotus in that Scotus, of course, advocated the freedom of God, that God does not have a determinate necessary nature. God covenants to relate to us in a certain way. That's the potentia Dei ordinata. But in his absolute essence, God is free to do whatever he wants. And of course, William of Aachen took this even further. Descartes follows Scotus in holding that God is unlimited in power and could have made the laws of logic other than they are. That what is existing is indeed the result of God's arbitrary will. Okay? Now, if you think about this, if God could have made things different, that means the way that things are now are the result of God's active willing. So the fact that we would metaphysically know something would, at the end of the day, finally connect to the imparted ability God gives us to metaphysically access the thing known. Does that make sense? That because the thing out here, whatever it is, even the laws of logic are finally in some sense contingent on God's will, then our ability to metaphysically know what is the case is due to God's having arbitrarily implanted this metaphysical truth in us. And that's a very interesting part of what he's about here. This is the voluntarism of Descartes. And of course, Descartes holds that human beings have free will, and that's the necessary condition for accessing the truth. If I'm caused all the time or determined to do this rather than that, I have no freedom to have done other than what I did do. The very notion of truth kind of comes into, the very notion of truth becomes suspect. And I think the best way to think about Descartes here is to think about an impartial judge, right? Impartial judge here. This defense attorney is over here, and the attorney for the people, the state's attorney is over here, and the judge is hearing these arguments, and then he or she decides which is the stronger argument. If the judge doesn't have the freedom to decide which of the ones is the stronger, if his will is compelled somehow, then he's not really an impartial judge. And one shouldn't expect his so-called judgments to track with truth at all, right? So this is what Descartes seems to have in mind, freedom of the will. Okay, now he has another idea, another argument for the existence of God, and I'm going to come back to that next time. We're going to come back to the argument, the other argument from the existence of God, and I'm Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. I'll be right back. Thank you.